as we make our way through this unit, so we've talked about meiosis now, producing gametes, producing sperm and egg cells for sexual reproduction. We're going to now start to get into a little bit more specifics about how plants reproduce sexually as well as humans. So we'll start with plants. And this is kind of a throwback to 7th grade. We had a unit on plants, and we studied pollination, flowers, and the reproductive structure. So this should be familiar. So we know plants can reproduce sexually. They have gametes, produce offspring that are combinations of traits from both parents. And the reproductive structures of plants are flowers. So flowering plants, the flower are reproductive structures. The name for flowering plants are angiosperms, which is different from gymnosperms, is the other type of plant. So inside of flowers, meiosis is happening to produce gametes, sperm and egg cell. The transfer of sperm to egg cell is typically called pollination, because the sperm cell itself is found in a grain of pollen. These are pollen grains shown under the microscope from various species. So if we look, here we see some pollen grains on the tip of an anther. So the stamen of the flower are the male structures. They have the anther, which is where the pollen grains form. And then holding them up is a structure called the filament. So for example, I think this is a lily. Here you see these are the anthers, and they're held up in the air by this filament. Here's an individual one. So this is where meiosis is happening. This is where pollen is being produced. Okay? So in the anther, diploid cells, cells with chromosomes in pairs, are dividing by meiosis to form haploid cells that are in the pollen itself. So a pollen grain is sort of an enclosed structure that has a sperm cell in it. Pollen grains can survive dehydration for a long time, survive dry environments, and once they reach the correct conditions, once they land in the proper spot, then they can start to grow. And what happens is once a pollen grain lands on the female structures of the flower, a tube starts to grow. And along that tube travels the actual sperm cell itself. The female parts of the flower are called the pistil. So this whole structure is the pistil. At the tip is called the stigma. This is the part that actually receives the pollen grains. So if a flower is going to be pollinated, pollen lands on the stigma of the female structure. At the base of that is the ovary, where the actual egg cells are stored. Those egg cells are called the ovules. They are haploid. Those are the egg cells of the plant. So if we look at an actual picture of the flower, you can see here we have the stamen and the anthers down here. And up here is the style, and at the top the stigma. Now, can you take an educated guess? Why is in this flower, why is the stigma way up here, but then the stamens are way down here? It's going to make it difficult for pollen from here to reach the stigma. Oh?
They don't want the pollen from the same plant to go to the pistil of the milk.
Right. So would it be ideal for pollen from one flower to self-pollinate, we call it, the same flower? Because that sort of reduces the benefit of sexual reproduction, which is add variation. We have pollen from the same flower fertilizing eggs in the same flower, but there's no added variation. Most plants typically have adaptations which allow them to encourage cross-pollination, pollen spreading from one flower to another. One of the ways they do that is through different heights of those. So this stigma is not going to catch pollen from this anther. The pollen from this anther is probably going to blow through the air and land on a stigma somewhere else of another flower. So it's an adaptation to cross-pollination. So here we see all of the parts sort of in one. This is what's called a perfect flower. Perfect flowers have both male and female structures in a single flower. We have the pistil, and we also have the stamens in the same flower. Those are the types of flowers that typically need adaptations to prevent self-pollination. There are some flowers that only have male parts or they only have female parts. They're called imperfect flowers. And that's an adaptation, again, to encourage cross-pollination. So, self-pollinate, so the term pollination means to have pollen transferred from the anther to the stigma. And if it's in the same plant, we call it self-pollination. But as Will was saying, that's typically not ideal for plants. Typically, plants want to encourage cross-pollination, increasing in variation. So that happens in various ways. Some flowers are pollinated by the wind. Okay? They rely on producing huge amounts of pollen in the stamens, and then that pollen just randomly blowing through the wind and hopefully landing on the stigma of a flower somewhere. So when you go outside like in the springtime and like your driveway's all green covered in pollen, those are pollen grains from wind pollinated flowers. They have to produce a lot of pollen because it's just kind of randomly floating through the air. Hello? No. No thanks. So wind pollinated flowers produce a lot of pollen. Typically they don't have nectar, they don't have colorful petals, they don't have a scent to them because they don't need any of those things because they're just relying on the wind to blow the pollen away. So they don't invest energy in all those other things. But many flowers are pollinated by animals. So insects are a very common pollinator, but also birds, even mammals, are sometimes pollinators. And so plants that use animal pollinators typically entice the animal to visit the flower in different ways. Sometimes it's with nectar, a reward for visiting that flower. Nectar is basically a sugary liquid that the insect or the bird can consume for energy. And in the process of visiting the flower to get the nectar, okay, the insect will get pollen on it. Okay, the pollen grains fall off, they get on the insect, and as this insect or bird or mammal goes and visits another flower, some of those pollen grains, it only takes one pollen grain, will fall off and land on the stigma of the female parts of another flower. So insects and birds and other animals are common pollinators. In fact, beekeepers are paid money to bring their beehives to orchards and put them on the land in the orchard and let their bees just stay there for a couple weeks, because the bees will go pollinate all the flowers, because if the flowers in, say, an apple tree are not pollinated, they won't form apples. The apple forms after pollination. Same thing with like almonds. In California, for example, they do this a lot. They have big semi-tractor trailers filled with bee, you know, when people keep bees, they're in like a rectangle, it looks like a dresser, and you have drawers that you pull out. You might see them like in fields around the way. They bring those, put them on the land, let the bees go do their thing, put them back in the truck, take them to another orchard and so forth.
How would they get them back in the box?
They just return back to the hive, so that's the hive. And so they return back, and then they just put them in those boxes and put them on the truck. So once, and so this is showing the waggle dance. I think we learned about that. Bees are social insects. They can communicate with each other, and bees actually tell each other where to find a good source of nectar by doing a little dance. And they do this dance where the angle in the hive that they're doing their little dance tells the other bees which direction to fly in relation to the sun. And the intensity of their little dance tells how far they need to go and how good the nectar is. So they can communicate this to other bees. Once pollination does happen and the pollen lands on the stigma of another flower, then what happens is the pollen grain grows this tube down the style of the pistil into the ovary, and then the nucleus travels down that tube, eventually combining in the ovule to form a little zygote. The zygote divides in mitosis to form an embryo, okay, and that becomes a seed. So that's what a seed is. A seed is a tiny little embryo of a plant along with some food for it and a protective coat. What typically happens with lots of plants is after the seeds form, a fruit forms around it. What's the purpose of a fruit? Why do plants, so pollination already happened. Why would plants invest all this energy growing an apple around a seed for them? How's that helpful, Matt?
Usually when it drops, it spreads the nutrients.
Well, that's in the seed. So there are nutrients inside of the seed that provide the growing seed with energy, but not all that other stuff around it. The plant doesn't use that. Well,
Animals go and eat it, and then once they go to the bathroom, the seeds.
yeah, it's for seed dispersal. So it wouldn't be good if a plant produced lots of seeds and they just all fall to the ground right there and then grow because they're all competing with each other. There's already a tree there that's going to shade it. So instead, plants encourage the dispersal of their seeds. And one way they do is by producing fruits, which animals consume. And then as the animals go around, eventually those seeds come out, and those seeds have been dispersed. All right, let's watch this video here about pollination. So after pollination, that's when fruits form. So pollination is allowing fertilization of the sperm in the ovule. And then, like I said, many types of plants will then form a fruit. Okay, the fruit develops from the ovary. So in our, the 7th graders, we just looked at these flowers. Now the flowers have all matured and lost their petals and all this things. But what you see here is this part. This is the ovary. So this one, this was pollinated, and that's why it's starting to form this enlargement here. So this is turning into the fruit of this flower. So in here are the seeds, which are those reproductive units. The seeds themselves contain everything basically that the seed would need to survive and develop. There's other ways besides fruits that are going to be consumed. For example, maple trees have those little helicopter things. Those use the wind to disperse seeds. A dandelion, some people, 7th graders didn't know this. Do you know that the yellow dandelion flower is the same flower as the white puffy thing? All right, yeah, they're 7th graders. Anyway, so when you blow on that thing and send the white stuff flying around, attached to each little piece of that is a tiny little seed. And so you're distributing the seeds, or as the wind blows, it sends the seeds flying. Some, like burdock, is a fruit, and it attaches to the fur of animals, and it gets on them, and then as they run around, eventually it falls off, and the seed has been dispersed. No, you can't eat them. But, so some are not like edible, and then there's fruits that have edible portions, which then are pooped out by animals and disperse the seeds. The seed itself, here we see the stages of germination. Seeds will germinate once they have proper conditions, once they have moisture, once they have oxygen, and then they can germinate. They don't require sunlight to germinate. The beginning of growth of the seed can happen in the dark. Okay? It starts to grow. Once the leaves emerge, the first leaves, that's when photosynthesis kicks in, and they do need sunlight. So when you look at the plant that's just starting to grow, the name for the parts, okay, are the hypo, which means under, which is the roots, and the part are the lower part of the stem. You have the roots down here. The cotyledon, this is where the energy was stored. The upper part is called the epicotyl. So if you eat a nut, for example, you know, like a peanut has 2 halves that it breaks into. Each of those halves is one of these cotyledons. What really that nut had, that's energy that was going to be used by that peanut when it grew. When you eat beans, what you're eating is actually the stored up food that was going to be used by that bean as it was growing. You ever, if you eat like whole peanuts, you know how they break in half? But then you know how there's also that other little small part that breaks off?
Yeah, the tiny little.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know what that is?
No.
That's
Oh.
the embryo. That's the little part that would have grown into the actual plant, right, before the peanut was roasted. But that's the embryo, and then the 2 halves are the energy. And that's where we get flour. Comes from wheat seeds. And if you buy whole wheat flour, you're getting the cotyledons plus the coat that's around the outside, plus the tiny little embryo that's in there, is all ground up to make whole wheat flour. If you get white flour or white bread, they use only the cotyledon. They get rid of the coat, they get rid of that little embryo, so that it's there's less fiber in there and less of that other material. All right, so tomorrow we'll talk about